We're going to talk about dairy trade policy right now. And this is always a contentious one when we talk about Canada and the US. If you think about the first NAFTA renegotiation that happened a few years back, it was one of the main, probably the largest contentious issue, especially from an agriculture perspective. And we expect that to be no different in the years to come. Joining us right now is the Senior Vice President of Trade and Workforce Policy with the International Dairy Foods Association, better known as the IDFA. It is Becky Vargas. Becky, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, okay. So I guess set the stage for us. Dairy trade, how is the U.S. doing from an export perspective?
It's been a challenging few years, I think, for everybody involved in dairy trade, regardless of your country of origin. We're doing okay with all the challenges that everyone has had, whether it's on the supply chain side, tariffs, agreements, increasing nationalization, you name it. But we're doing okay. I think we see some challenges on the horizon with what we'd like to achieve. We feel we have quite a solid supply and would like to have more competitive access to world markets than we feel we currently have. But we've managed to come through the last few years of pandemic and ups and downs, I think, better than probably some people expected at certain points.
Now, I mentioned the contentious issue of Canada-U.S. trade policy when it comes to dairy. We had two dispute resolution panels look at the USMCA agreement, and we had both countries claim victory for sure on the first panel resolution. What can we expect going forward? What's going to be the ask from a U.S. dairy perspective as it relates to trade with Canada?
Sure. I mean, it's a really interesting time in the agreement's history, right? We had those two dispute settlement panels. Obviously, IDFA and others on the U.S. side were quite disappointed with the outcomes. We feel the text was very clear in what it was trying to achieve, and that Canada simply isn't even trying to meet those terms on TRQ administration. We could go down a similar discussion path on pricing if you like. But what I think is really fascinating is right now, we just are on the heels of a separate panel announcing a U.S. win on the SPS chapter on biotech corn in Mexico.
Yeah.
So there are aspects of dispute settlement in the panel and panels under the agreement that are working and working well, we think. And moving forward, we're on the brink of the review of the full agreement. How's it working? Do the partners want to recommit? In the midst of impending tariff discussions. So it's a real fascinating time to look at this agreement, which is relatively new for these trading partners, and see where we go from here.
One of the GM corn, also a difference there was Mexico saying, okay, at least this is my understanding, we will accommodate, or we will respect the ruling of the panel. That has not been the situation on the dairy. As Canada has said in the case of the first dispute panel, 3 of the 4 points we're going to claim victory, and the U.S. had 1 of the 4. But the U.S. side, as we've had different people in the show, have said that that's the most important of the points. So, in a review or renegotiation, is it a case of the U.S. looking for more market access, or is it Canada follow what you agreed to the first time that the U.S. is really after going forward?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, right? There's some voices in the U.S. side that are always going to want more. There's some who will just say, hey, could we get a fighting chance at what we have? IDFA tends to have a kind of a more balanced view, I would say. We have members on both sides of the border. I think personally, if you had just had Canada follow the terms that were written, follow the quota quantities that were written into the agreement, allow the tariff rate quotas to function the way they're designed, right? Like the tariff is astronomical once it exceeds the quota. So no one's going to be incentivized to exceed the amount in the quota. If Canada had just allowed those to be administered in a way that allowed imports to come in, I think that we might have far less that we'd be fighting about on the TRQ side. We can go down the same discussion on pricing, but I don't think that on the U.S. side, we feel there's been a real fair shake at Canada living up to its commitments.
For people that aren't living in this on a daily basis and they're reading trade texts and trying to, in the weeds of this, from your perspective, what is Canada doing?
So I think that Canada is creating whatever conditions it can to keep the quota under the TRQ administration from naturally filling. So that just means that there's all these preconditions that an importer or distributor in Canada has to meet in order to be able to obtain quota and import product. And they're completely outlandish, right? Like you have to have been doing it for an X number of years. You have to have all these demonstrated ways that you're connected to agriculture in Canada and that you have this address and it just goes on and on and on. And so when you have a real constrained environment like that to be able to import it, it discourages business and it creates this supply chain where dairy processors in Canada are the ones most incentivized to import their own competing products. So if we would just remove some of those layers of bureaucracy and rules around the import process, allow the quotas to fill up to the level, and then, put whatever tariff you want on top of that after the quota fills, I don't think it would be all that detrimental to the Canadian industry. That's how a TRQ is designed to function. It's a protection for your own industry.
How big of an opportunity do your members see Canada as being? It's a country of 40 million people. Annual consumption of dairy alone is about, I think I calculated about like 2.5 billion liters. There's some states that almost produce that much or more. So how is the Canadian market viewed from an opportunity standpoint?
It's kind of similar to other dairy producing countries. There's always going to be areas where the U.S. produces specific products. It could be ingredients or yogurts or things that just are not produced as significantly in Canada, similar to the EU or another dairy producing country. We all kind of have our strengths as dairy producers, right? And so there's ways that your consumers might want greater options of choice, or we might have a more specialized ingredient that you don't. And we should be able to meet each other's needs in that regard on a fair playing field.
What other markets is the U.S. focused on as opportunities to increase exports?
Southeast Asia has been a huge region for us for the past several years. I think something like 5 or 6 of our top 10 markets are almost always in Southeast Asia. And so once you add Canada, Mexico, China to that list, you just about have your top 10 right there. You also just see consistent growth in those economies' GDPs. Their middle class, as their middle class changes, they consume more animal products and more dairy products. And so we just want to continue to see that build and grow. I think, longer term, that's the short term. That's been happening for a while. So that at a certain point, you'll reach a saturation. Longer term, there's plenty of opportunities I think the United States hasn't really tapped into yet for a variety of reasons, whether it's, history or time invested or policies or what have you, that, we frequently say at IDFA, we think we're one of the best positioned to just help feed the world and meet basic food security needs over time. Dairy is a high dense nutritious product. So we want to take that to places where those needs exist even more.
When we do have a review, and many expect there to be a review as of July 1st of 2026, or maybe even sooner when it comes, I think we've seen that incoming President Trump expects to work aggressively on the trade file. Trade will be a very important component of the administration's platform. Do you expect dairy to have the same level of focus as it did in the NAFTA renegotiation, or are there other issues that maybe trump dairy, so to speak?
That was an excellent pun. I think it will. I think it absolutely can, and it should, right? So in the agreement, there's written into it a review of the dairy pricing article, Canada's commitments on pricing for dairy, and that review happens next year, not in 2026. So there's kind of a natural cadence here that's about to occur in terms of the full agreement review. And in the first Trump administration, Ambassador Lighthizer at the time, our trade representative at the time, was extremely well versed on the dairy issues with Canada. Personally, he had a strong knowledge of them and understanding of them. And even though he's not currently, nominated on the next cabinet, he's certainly behind the scenes, and I would expect. This incoming administration, I think, has been preparing for quite a while for what they expected to be an electoral win. And I don't expect them to hit the ground, with any kind of naivete or lack of education on some of the key problems.
Becky, thanks a lot for joining us here today on Real Ag Radio. And I know, based on how much of a focus dairy will get in any sort of trade negotiation or discussions between Canada and the U.S. or beyond that, dairy is always a part of that discussion. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.